it's really heartening to see quite an impressive crowd on a Sunday afternoon. It is actually precisely lunchtime, but it's very encouraging that most of you have made it. Yeah. So yesterday, Jonathan was sitting and seeking answers from author Vivek Shanbag. But today he's on the other side, and we'll be seeking answers from Jonathan about his latest book called The Girl from Fergana. So, who is this girl from Fergana? Where is Fergana? Why is Fergana important? And what is this beautiful Chinese tea chest doing on the cover? So, Jonathan, without giving away much, I'd just like to tell the audience that Fergana, the girl from Fergana is none other than Jonathan's mother, Stella. And Fergana is a valley which was, on the old ancient Silk Roads, where trade thrived, where cultures coexisted happily, and which was a very historic place, which is today somewhere near Uzbekistan. And about the tea chest, it is, there were a lot of secrets in the tea chest, and from there, Jonathan unravels lots of secrets, which we shall discover as we go along. So, this is a rich and fascinating book, I must say. In fact, I was very moved after I read the book. It's so much of history. It's also a personal memoir. It's about language. It's about cultural relations. It's about also the lament of, what was once a very cosmopolitan Silk Road. So there's a lot in this book, and if at all y'all can, please buy the book, because it's really a very interesting and fascinating book. So, Jonathan, moving on, this book comes at a time, it couldn't have come at a better time. Now, we live in a world of wars, displacement, migration, and also ethno-religious conflicts, right? So, were these dark times the trigger for this book, or was it something else?
Thank you, Stanley. That's an excellent question. I think books never have one origin. I mean, you have a germ of an idea, but the germ meets other germs and turns into something else. I'd always wanted to write the story of my mother because, number one, it was a fascinating story. But number two, it was a story whose details were not immediately available to me because my mother wouldn't speak about them. She was a Polish Jew who had been born in 1932, who was displaced by the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939. Unlike the rest of her family, who ended up dying in the camps in Auschwitz, she and her immediate family were deported to a gulag in the Soviet Union because she ended up on the Soviet side of partitioned Poland. She always described her time in the Soviet Union as her time in Russia. I knew that wasn't quite accurate because I knew that she'd lived in a village called Uzgen, and I'd looked at it on the map, and I saw that it was in a state called the Kyrgyz Soviet Republic. This was the 1960s, 1970s. And when I asked my mother, that, so you were living in Asia, she'd say, no, I was living in Russia. So when I was young, there wasn't much furniture in my family's house. My mother was a refugee. My father was fairly poor too. But we did have this ornate Chinese tea chest, which dominated the scenery. And I was absolutely fascinated by it. A, because it was beautiful. It had these extraordinary carvings on it of what at the time I thought were Chinese monks. But B, I knew that inside that chest there were secrets that my mother didn't want me to know. And I knew that because I tried to open the chest and the smell of naphtha would come out. I could see sawdust, but also a myriad of documents put in shoe boxes and bags, spilling over with photos, occasional paintings even. And I wondered what on earth were these. That smell of naphtha always betrayed me because my mother would smell it from another room and she'd come swooping in like a genie called in a lamp and slam the top shut and say, "No, you are not to open this." And these were documents from her past. They included photos of family members who had died, who I'd never met. And it was only once she succumbed to Alzheimer's in the 2010s that I was finally able to open this chest and discover some of the secrets there. And I was astonished by what I found. Yes, I'd known she'd lived in Asia, but I hadn't quite understood the ambience of the Asia in which she lived. Uzgen was at the heart of the old Silk Roads, and that it was a market town in a valley, the Fergana Valley, that had powerful connections with the place I'd chosen to live in. Of course, the Fergana Valley was the birthplace of Babur, the first Mughal emperor. But Fergana had long been historically linked to northern India, at least, by trade and also by culture. Even the name Fergana seems to be related to the Sanskrit Pargana, the province beyond. Many Indians resided there, but so did Persians, Turks, Chinese, later Russians, and Jews. And this was the most astonishing discovery for me, that my mother, a Polish Jew who'd been deported along with 250,000 other Polish Jews, this is a story that's not very well known, to Central Asia, was living side by side with Jews who had lived in Central Asia for around 2,500 years. And so I wanted to understand better the story of these Jews who had lived in a world long before there were nation states. This is in many ways a book about the history of borderlessness before the time of nation states, which were in many ways the gift of Europe to the rest of the world. The Fergana Valley had never been a nation, but it was subdivided in the 20th century, even though it's a very small strip of land. It's about 200 kilometers long, but only 30 kilometers wide. And it is the most ethnically plural part of the world. Tajiks, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks live side by side, but also so did Kazakhs, Gypsies, Chinese, and Jews. And this was divided up into 3 nation states in the 20th century, and a place that had never known ethno-religious violence. Suddenly, these people started hating each other. They started hating people who'd been their neighbors for centuries, even millennia. So the book turned into something else. It was a memoir of my mother, but it was also a memoir of our part of the world and the extraordinarily toxic impact of borders and nation states that we have come to believe are natural.
Jonathan, you seem to be one of those obedient sons who, didn't really go and open the tea chest after your mother's warning. But most of us, while growing up, whatever is forbidden, we go for that, right? So I was a bit intrigued. How come you never went and peeped into it or tried to see what is inside the chest?
Believe me, I tried. But I think very early on, my sisters and I learned the lesson very strongly that my mother's past was a no-fly zone. Because the trauma of what she had lost was so huge for her. And we learned fairly early on that our job as her children was to make her feel happy, to not remind her of the dark clouds that seemed to haunt her every day. It took me a while, many decades, to realize that what she had lost was not just family members who had perished in the camps. She lost both her parents also in the Fergana Valley. Both of them are buried there. But she also lost a world of connections with other people, including, you mentioned that the title character of the book is my mother. That is true, but it's only half true. The girl from Fergana is equally my mother, and the girl with whom she shared her mud hut after she'd been orphaned, a girl named Kamra Khan, who was an Uzbek Muslim girl. And with this title, I wanted to communicate something that is very true, but we, for the most part, tend to disavow, that identity is never singular. That our identity is not simply one identity, one religion, say, one nation, one language. It's also with whom we are connected, who our neighbors are. And the more I delved into the chest, the more I delved into the history of the Fergana Valley and Jews along the Silk Road, the more I realized that the canard that Jews and Muslims are historical, timeless enemies is absolutely false. My mother was indoctrinated after the war into Zionism. She moved to Palestine. Because she'd lost her parents, I think she was in search of something that would give her a sense of home, that would give her a sense of security. And Zionism did that. At the cost of disavowing these lived connections she'd had with Kamra Khan, with other people in the Fergana Valley. And it was, in effect, a partition, not just a space, a partition in Palestine, a partition in the Fergana Valley, but a partition in my mother's memory. There was part of her that could remember a time when her best friends were Muslims. But she'd been indoctrinated, brainwashed into an ideology that told her Muslims are your mortal enemies. Muslims will push us Israelis into the sea. And I had a strong sense that this was a contradiction. I remember declaring when I was a young boy, because my mother had taken me on protests against various things, apartheid, protests in support of Maori land rights in New Zealand. She had instilled in us a very sort of strong sense of social justice. And I'd been reading the newspapers, and I'd found out about Palestinians, and so I declared at the age of 11 or 12, I think I support Yasser Arafat, because clearly the Palestinians have been disenfranchised. For a week, my mother wouldn't speak with me. My father told me off for hurting her. My sisters rounded on me. And I said, but I'm just doing what my mother would have wanted me to do, which is to empathize with those who are suffering. It was a contradiction that I was never able to resolve. And this book is my attempt to come to terms with a mother who was divided in time between someone who had very deep and profound relationships with her Muslim neighbors and someone who had been indoctrinated into hating later Muslim neighbors in Palestine.
Right. So the Chinese tea chest is almost a character in the book. So Jonathan, at what point did you realize that that object contained the seed of an entire narrative for the book?
It's, again, a good question. I was going through the objects in the tea chest, and they were not organized in any coherent way. My mother had just thrown materials into the chest and each time slammed the lid shut. She was an archivist of her own past who couldn't bear to confront the materials she'd archived. I initially started by trying to organize these materials into some kind of coherent sequence, and I couldn't. What I became more enthralled by was the way in which all these various materials were arbitrarily sort of thrust into proximity with each other. And so I found myself thinking about how the fantasy of a linear narrative that tells a story from the point of origin to the end is precisely that. It's a fantasy. Our lives are, in fact, much more like the contents of the tea chest in their messiness, in terms of the arbitrariness of connections that are formed. And my mother was sort of thrown by history into all these different locations, whether it's the Gulag in Siberia or the 5 years in the Fergana Valley that she spent. But she was thrown into these proximities that meant a great deal to her. Now, I'd never known about Kamra Khan, her best friend. Kamra Khan came out as a story only when my mother sort of began to succumb to Alzheimer's. What was extraordinary was that she hadn't spoken about her in 70 years. But the memory of Kamra Khan made her well up with tears. I was, of course, fascinated and curious. I would ask her, I'd say, Ima, what did Kamra Khan look like? She couldn't remember. What she could remember was the smell of Kamra Khan's clothes in winter. And that really stayed with me. The image suggested to me a hug. To smell her clothes, she had to be close to her. And my mother said this not with distaste, but with deep emotion. I remember the smell of her clothes. And of course, why was that hug happening? She'd just lost her mother, and Kamra Khan was providing support to her. My mother couldn't remember Kamra Khan's physical appearance, but she could remember that gesture of love. Yet that love was something that had to be wrapped up and put in a chest, because the pain of remembering it was so great, thanks to the weight of indoctrination that the Israeli state had put on her.
Yeah. There are more interesting and profound questions that I would like to touch upon, but sorry, Jonathan, I would like to delve a little more into this Chinese tea chest. Did this tea chest serve as the main archive for you, or did you have to deep dive into books and research and libraries and whatnot?
So
briefly.
It was my primary archive. I had to do a lot of research. I was writing this book during COVID, so I disappeared down a lot of rabbit holes online, finding extraordinary information about Jewish-Muslim neighborliness. One thing I don't want to give too much away about the book, but one of the things that I learned was that Jewishness did not originate in ancient Israel. This is what I'd been taught, of course. But Jews didn't exist until the Silk Road. Israelites had been taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar and taken to Babylon in the 550 BCE. But at that point, Israelites were not yet Jews. They only became Jews in Babylon as a result of conversations with their Parsi neighbors, their Zoroastrian neighbors. So certain aspects of Judaism that we now consider absolutely sort of intrinsic to being Jewish. For instance, the idea of a Messiah, Moshiach, that came from Zoroastrianism. The ancient Israelites had no idea of a heaven or a hell. That came from Zoroastrianism. The ritual, it was something bizarre for me when I was growing up, but any hair that was cut, any fingernails that were cut had to be buried. That came from Zoroastrianism. The Hebrew script, which is such a vital part of Jewish identity, was the script of the Arameans, who were another people who had taken residence in Babylon. And when the Persians conquered Babylon and liberated the Jews, the Persians made Aramaic the lingua franca of the Achaemenid Empire. So Aramaic script was used in Persian official documents. Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor, when he erected pillars in the north of his empire, had them inscribed in Aramaic script so they'd be understandable to Persian merchants, Jewish merchants as well, who were traveling those routes. But Jewishness, in other words, arose in conversation with neighbors. It wasn't something that emerged fully formed by itself from the grounds of Israel. Also, an important archive for me. Conversations I had with people that you wouldn't find in books. I was traveling along territories of the Silk Roads, and I'd keep having conversations with people that made me realize culture is never a singular tradition. It is always a conversation with others. So, for instance, I was in Bukhara, and I was speaking at the bazaar there to a merchant who asked me, where do I live? I said, in India. Without missing a beat, he started singing. Avara home. And I was taking a taxi in Shiraz, sorry, not Shiraz, Isfahan. No, it was Shiraz in Iran. Again, the same question, where are you from? I said, well, I'm from New Zealand, but I live in India. Without missing a beat, Shairi from Khusro. Right? The fact is, the Silk Roads was not just a network along which commodities like silk or tea or sugar were transported. Merchants would travel up and down the Silk Roads, and it would take a long time to get from one point to another. They would spend nights in caravanserais with other merchants. And what would they do? They would eat together, and they would exchange stories, and they would exchange songs. Speaking in different languages, they would interact with each other and learn from each other. Jewish stories would make their way to the most unlikely places. The national epic of Kyrgyzstan is the story of Jacob. But it is told in Turkic, and it has a Persian name, Manas Dastani. So conversations between Turks, Persians, and Jews had to happen for the Kyrgyz to become Kyrgyz. You see the point I'm making here?
Yeah.
No culture emerges fully formed from one soil. It emerges as a result of conversations that people have with their neighbors. Right. And this is something that the institution of the nation state has made us forget, particularly when the nation state is scaffolded by the kind of ideology that insists to belong to that nation, you must be this type of person who prays to this God and who speaks this language. We're forgetting that language is a mode of communication. It is not simply a sacred should tradition. Every language contains within it the traces of other languages because conversations have happened between people who speak different languages.
Right.
And this is also one of the themes of the book.
Yeah, very illuminating, Jonathan. And